All right, good morning. Go ahead and grab a seat. Good morning, Emmaus. Glad to be with you this first week of the Advent season. It is the Advent season is the 4 weeks, 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. And we're going to be taking a look at Luke. We spent like 10 weeks in just a few verses of the end of Luke. So we figure let's spend the next couple of years in the whole of Luke. And then might as well follow up with volume 2 at some point, the Acts of the Apostles. So anyways, this Advent season, we're asking these questions like, what makes Jesus unique? What makes him unique among the great figures of history? What does his origin story in the Gospel of Luke reveal about his purpose and mission and identity? Why is it that Jesus continues to provide hope for his followers? These kinds of questions will be examined in our Advent series as we go through Luke's introduction to Jesus. As we look at this ancient biography of the person of Jesus. If you are new to church, if you are just exploring Christian faith, or maybe returning after a long period away from church, I hope that these weeks of Advent are helpful to you in your search today. We're all on a road. We are all on a journey, and so wherever you are on that road and journey today, you're welcome, and we hope to be the kind of church where Jesus meets you on the road and opens all of our eyes to who he is and what he's come to do. Now, when you meet a person, they are generally unknown to you, right? You only know them in general when you first meet a person. But to really know a person, right, that means you know them in their particulars. That means you know the unique things that make them them. No one is a person in general, right? We're always really known in our particulars. So like when we hire a staff person, for example, we know generally the sort of job that they need to be able to do that we hope they'll accomplish. But you get a sense of their particulars in a relationship, maybe in an interview, and observing them at work and knowing their story. And sometimes you hire a particular person and build a job around them because of how they're uniquely gifted or qualified. Or to use an example from my married life, right? When I was younger, I knew I wanted to be married and I wanted a wife, but only in general. Marriage itself is actually learning to love a person in particular. Those two things are at odds, right? No one is a cardboard cutout of a role. We are all particulars. And so, like for my wife, it was her birthday last weekend, and so you might think, this is the sort of age where a surprise party might feel appropriate. It shows effort and thought. Well, you might also think I'm dumb enough to throw my wife a surprise party, but that's not what she ever wants. I'm not that dumb. In fact, I know her in particular that she loves spontaneity but hates surprises, and so I would never throw her a surprise party. What if this was all like a long setup for next year's surprise party? Yeah, boo. All right. In other words, it's the particulars about a person that makes them who they are. And the particulars about a person and that sets them apart. And knowing the particulars helps you relate rightly to whoever it is we're relating to. Because relationships require attention to the particulars, not just the generalities. And so this morning, as we begin to examine Luke's gospel, this good news historical biography from the ancient world that looks at the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, as we begin to look at Luke's gospel for a good while, there is a particularity to Jesus that sets him apart and shows us how to engage him and relate to him based on his particularities. 3 things I want to show you that Jesus had in particular. He had in particular a set of eyewitnesses that make him accessible, a moment in history that makes him helpful, and then a preparation for his arrival that makes him meaningful. So first, this morning, Jesus has this particular accessibility because he has a particular set of eyewitnesses. Listen to Luke's introduction This is what he says. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers or servants of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty about the things you have been taught. So Luke, the author, who was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, is writing to his friend Theophilus, and he's saying, this is about what God accomplished among us in our lifetime, in our little part of the world. This is a story full of first-hand accounts. God did something among us, and we're getting the stories down in a clear and orderly way so it's easy to follow. In other words, Luke wants future generations, for as long as possible, to get as close to firsthand as you can possibly get to the accounts of what happened. He's writing a news article, not an advice column. He's telling you what happened. And so what those who were from the beginning, eyewitnesses, have delivered, he's now collecting and saying, I'm putting this in an orderly fashion. He's saying, look, the impact and influence of this person, Jesus, was so significant. It was so big that the first generation who saw him, heard him, related to him, were with him. They have such a wealth of oral tradition, of stories and eyewitness accounts, that these people's experience with Jesus has to be written down. And he's saying, I'm putting it all together in an orderly way so you can be sure of what you've been told. So the first thing here in Luke about the particularity of Jesus is that he had eyewitnesses. Why is that important? Well, think of a documentary on Netflix or a docuseries, and imagine trying to present a story on some athlete or some chef or whoever, and then, getting to the production table and going, all right, how are we going to tell this story? What footage do we have? And then the other folks who are supposed to be responsible for this docuseries are like, well, we don't really have any footage. Okay, well, do we have any, secondhand information? Oh, we kind of have some rumors, right? That wouldn't be much of a story if you didn't have any first-hand eyewitness accounts, if you didn't have footage. It wouldn't get you closer to that figure. You wouldn't really have any access to them. You would just get secondhand information. But the gospel Luke writes down, what he's doing is he's saying there's a lot of footage, at least from the ancient world. That means stories. That means first-hand witness accounts. And so he says, there's a lot of footage. And so I'm going to edit it. I'm going to put it together in a way that shows Jesus as accurately as possible. And so he has this first-hand eyewitness ancient footage, like when the 10 lepers got healed later on in Luke, and one comes back to thank him. How do you think that story got passed on? Probably from the one who came back and thanked him, right? That dude who got healed went around telling that story. And so Luke's collecting stories like that. Or how did people know the parable of the prodigal that Jesus told while he was at dinner with all these sinners and tax collectors, and religious leaders were critiquing him for his audience? And well, the sinners who were at the table heard him tell this story, and they saw themselves inside his story, and they were like, we were lost, but now we're found, and now we're telling the story because we were there. We're eyewitnesses. And so what's the point of this first idea here? There's little debate today in scholarly circles as to whether or not a man named Jesus lived in first century Palestine, gathered a following, inspired generation after generation. There's pretty much it's pretty impossible to deny from any historical vantage point. There's no reason for us to still be talking about him unless this happened. But this introduction is saying that what was said about Jesus doesn't fit the category of myth. It doesn't fit the category of vibes. It fits the category of eyewitness testimony. What it means is that Jesus doesn't fit into a general category of religious figures that we don't really know much about. Like we got their teaching, but we don't know really what happened with them in their personal life. You see, the first eyewitnesses, they thought that his life was just as important as his teaching. They thought the events that happened were just as important as everything he said. And what it means is that Jesus is not a story, a feeling, or a vibe, but a person with a community of people who had firsthand eyewitness accounts, and we have their verbal footage, if you will. Life today in our very contested, information-saturated world is difficult for us to discern what's true, like what in the media is true, what that's said by leaders and can be counted on, which podcasters can you trust or whatever. You'd need a full-time fact checker for just about everything that you scroll through. And there was, in the first century sense, a community of fact checkers. There were all these people who were eyewitnesses together and could call each other out on discrepancies. There were eyewitnesses whose testimony didn't gain them comfort. Today, when you read something in the news, you have to ask the question, who stands to gain from this angle? And here's what's fascinating about these eyewitnesses who were from the beginning servants of the word, as Luke calls them. There are servants. They didn't have anything to gain from a worldly perspective by sharing their story. What they had to gain was not comfort, but death and persecution. They had everything to lose by being eyewitnesses and nothing to gain from a worldly sense. But like Paul, the apostle, they were not ashamed of the gospel. And so the particularity of Jesus is that we have access to his life, to his words, to his story from firsthand witnesses, which means that he's not dismissible as a mere figure for whom we have very little footage or reliable information to make any sense of him. What we have here is not the invention of a later church trying to protect its political power, using Jesus to prop itself up, but we have early first-generation eyewitness accounts who shared what they saw and heard, and then they staked their lives on it. And what Luke's doing is he's taking what was spoken and putting it down in writing before those eyewitnesses died off. And so he's saying, this is for you, to his friend, so that you can be sure of what you have. So this Advent, we're looking at a person whose ancient biographers had more firsthand accounts than most of us modern people will ever hope to have in our own lives. Secondly, Jesus had a particular moment in history. So he had a particular set of eyewitnesses that make him accessible. He also has a particular moment in history that also means that he can be helpful. He had an address, sort of, right? He lived in a place called Nazareth, right, until about 30, with his dad and mom or his adopted dad and mom died off. Well, Joseph died off, and we know Mary was around at his death. So he lived there in Nazareth. He traveled around the Palestinian countryside. He was hosted in homes by friends and borrowed rooms in the city of Jerusalem. He had a borrowed tomb that he was in for a hot second, and he's no longer there. Right? What we have is a real person in real time and place. Listen to what Luke says. In the days of Herod, a well-attested to historical figure, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah from the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So this is a story of concrete historical people in a concrete historical moment. What do I mean that he had a moment in history? This seems kind of obvious, right? Don't we all? What I mean is Luke is not writing a religious tract or sharing a theological system of ideas. He's writing a history about a concrete person who existed in history. He's not writing a manifesto of ideas disconnected from reality. He's writing a biography about the life and death and resurrection of a person. And then the story immediately goes from the wide-angle lens of Judea and this political leader to a Jewish couple that can't have babies. Which means this, right? Jesus is born into a particular time and place with a particular story. Nothing Jesus says or does would be of any help today to you if all he was a myth or a theory or a program. If Jesus is no more than a nice feeling or idea, he would be of no help to you whatsoever. He would be another burden to just try harder at everything. He'd be no different to you than a diet or a workout plan. Diets and workout plans are great. They don't help you with death. They don't help you at death, right? They might prolong death just a minute, right? But the reality is they don't help you in the face of the big questions of life. The fact that Luke is writing a history, a biography, means that Jesus can actually be of help to you today because he helped real historical people who became eyewitnesses to his historicity. He didn't show up aloof from the problems of everyday life. He showed up under Roman occupation in the homeland of Israel. He showed up in the long story of God and Israel among people with real problems, people like Elizabeth and Zechariah, who experienced social shame because they couldn't have what was in their day social currency, children. It says two quick implications I want to point out before we move to our third point. Jesus had a particular historical moment, which means that we can't rightly relate to him and his particulars by ignoring the context he came from, as if he can just mean whatever we want him to mean to us. And so when Jesus says, for example, in Luke chapter 4, that his mission matches that of the Spirit-anointed servant of Isaiah 61, that his mission is to set the captive free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and good news to the poor, that can't mean whatever we feel like it means. If Jesus is a historical person in a historical time and place, then it means that what Jesus says is something that only would make sense within that story of Israel. And so we don't get to just kind of invent Jesus to be a person of our creation, as if he's kind of they don't have this anymore, but as if he's a Build-A-Bear, right? As we just kind of take a little bit, I like this teaching, I don't like that teaching, I like that he did this nice thing, I don't care so much for the judgment passages. We don't get to construct a Jesus. If he's a historical person, then to relate to him in his particularities is to relate to him in what he said and what he must have meant within that context. Are you with me? Yeah. That just feels respectful, right? That's how you would want somebody to treat you. And so we're going to treat Jesus with the same kind of dignity. And so Jesus, not a creation of our preferences, but a person of history, is somebody who comes in a specific time and place, and his words have to mean something particular in that moment, or else they don't mean anything anywhere. The second implication of this point is that because his life was concrete and historical, he can actually help you in your life and its concrete historical nature. Listen to what the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 2. Since therefore the children, he's talking about humans, share in flesh and blood, that's this stuff, right? The meat that makes you a walking, living human. He, Jesus himself, likewise partook in the same things, flesh and blood, the contours of history and the concrete nature of being a human in time and space. He says that he partook in the same things. Why? That through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Look at verse 16. For surely it is not the angels he helps, right? Those people who don't live inside human history, but are cosmic beings who live in some sort of disjunction with the space-time that continuum. I don't know how that works, but they're in another dimension, right? They can enter ours and talk. Yeah. So sorry, I'm geeking out. Verse 16. It's not the angels that he helps, but he helps who? The offspring of Abraham, flesh and blood people, right? People who trust the word of the Lord. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. So Luke's saying, look, he has a particular set of eyewitnesses, he's accessible to you through their story. But he's also, he entered our story through a certain time and a certain place, and because of that, he can actually help you. Because what Luke is presenting happened in time and space within human history, then you can expect God to work in time and space in your own human history. That's where he will meet you and work. The Eastern Church Fathers had this saying, they said that the unassumed is the unhealed. I think it was Gregory of Nazianzen in his treatise on the Incarnation where he says this. But what he means by the unassumed is the unhealed is he's saying, look, if God didn't take on human flesh, then humanity is left unhelped, unhealed. But if he's taken on human flesh, then we have every reason to hope in the help of God to set our lives back on track through Jesus, and therefore all human history with Jesus. And so as hopeless as sometimes the headlines make the world out to be, what we have is the Redeemer who stepped into history and will bring it to its rightful end. What we have when we look at our own lives and go, I'm out of joint. My affections keep veering in the wrong direction. I keep falling for the same lie over and over, or whatever it is today for you. We look to Jesus who entered our story so that he can help us in it. Nothing in the gospel accounts is a waste of words. Every word is intentional. And that this happened in a particular time and place means that your particulars are not hopeless either. But they are the arena in which God works to bring salvation today. That's the story Luke's telling. And so, if that's true, you have hope. Do you believe this message? Now, if Jesus is attested to by witnesses, he's accessible, right? If he entered history, then he's helpful, right? He's objective, not just subjective. He's not a subjective set of feelings. He's a concrete, objective person. And it is with him in particular that we must deal. And so then, what does the particular preparation for Jesus' arrival have to tell us about how we must deal with him? This is the third point this morning. What does Luke's unique camera angle have to say about the category of person that Jesus fits within? How do these stories preparing for Jesus' arrival show us how to relate to Jesus? All the gospel writers start their story in a different spot. Mark picks up at the baptism of Jesus. Matthew, he tells a genealogy, he tells a family history that reminds us of Abraham and points us towards Moses in a unique way. John, he starts his story with Genesis 1:1, basically, right? He goes, in the beginning, except he doesn't say what Genesis 1:1 says. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and then he tells us that it's actually through Jesus that the whole creation came into being. But Luke, he starts his story different. He starts with an old Jewish couple that can't have babies. He picks a small corner in the world to start his story. And the allusion to this couple and what's going on in their story is an allusion to a very particular moment in Israel's history, to the story of Israel's monarchy. And this is really important. we're reminded instantly of the story of 1 Samuel chapter 1, the story of Hannah and her husband Elkanah. Except this time, Luke presents us with a father, Zechariah, not the mother who's in the temple. And it's he himself that is a priest, not merely appearing before the priest Eli like in Samuel's story. N.T. Wright says that Luke's story has the exact same shape in many ways as Samuel's story. This couple who's longing for a child is taken up within the divine purpose, right? And also the same triumphant conclusion. Hannah's song is echoed now by not only Mary's song, but Zechariah's song later on in the chapter. And it is a story of both judgment and salvation. In Samuel, the couple have this baby, the prophet Samuel, who announces God's judgment on the priests and ultimately on Israel's first king, Saul. Samuel is also the one who anoints King David, who paves the way for the king after God's own heart. And so Samuel enacts both judgment on Eli's house and Saul's house, as well as anoints the king who brings salvation. Here in Luke, the couple longing for a child end up not with Samuel, but with John the Baptist, the prophet who paves the way for the king, for the Messiah, who announces the coming king, calls attention to the Spirit-anointed royal Son of God at his baptism. John also enacts judgment, calls Israel's leaders to repentance on the banks of the Jordan, and also anoints the king who brings salvation. You need to see what Luke's doing with his story. David's story progresses through life as an outcast, leading a motley crew of followers in the Judean wilderness, and reaches its climax in the moment when Saul and Jonathan are slain and David is anointed king, and his first act is to go to Jerusalem, the city that becomes the capital. Jesus' story progresses through his wandering with his motley crew of followers in Galilee and elsewhere, and it reaches its climax when he comes to Jerusalem and he's slain now, right? Where amidst all the expectations of Israel's God coming to become king. And so there's this message of judgment on the existing regime, but also a message of salvation. The highest moment in Samuel's story is not the denunciation of Israel, but the anointing of young David. On that occasion, the text says that the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily on David from that day forward. And then God promises David a son who will rule from his throne and establish his kingdom forever. And he says, I will be a father to him. Then the highest moment for John, this boy born to Zechariah and Elizabeth, it's not his prophetic warning against the wrath to come, but his baptism of Jesus. This occasion when Luke tells us that the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus in bodily form like a dove, and a voice announced from heaven in words full of Davidic overtones, you are my son, the beloved, with you I'm well pleased. What is Luke doing? How is he preparing us for the arrival of Jesus? Do you see the shape of his story is mapped on to David's story in a unique way to say that John the Baptist is playing Samuel to Jesus' David? The Hellenistic and Roman kingdoms of the world are receiving notice that there's a new kingdom, that Israel's God, right, is moving in to reign and rule, that the young man now anointed by his cousin in the Jordan River is the king through whom God reigns and rules. It's a long way of saying that the particularity of how Jesus is introduced, how we're prepared to meet him, sets us up to see that he's a king. That he's not just a religious figure who wants us to perhaps take a bit of his teaching and apply it in some parts of our lives, but he is a king, the long-awaited king who comes to reign and rule. And so the question for us today is, are we prepared for the king? This is the question of Advent. Am I prepared for the arrival of the king? Perhaps I've related to Jesus in a very abstract way, as if he's got some good ideas for a good and prosperous life. Or I've made him really spiritual and kind of abstracted him from the everyday aspects of my life and my loyalties and my loves. So if he's a king, we allow the concreteness of who he is to shape the concrete parts of our own lives. Not just abstracting him, but allowing his reign and rule to touch down on the minutia of our lives. The category of king isn't easy for us to accept in American culture. We like our autonomy and we like to rule ourselves. But with the rise of anxiety with our autonomy, we should ask the question, is that really working for us? How well does self-rule work for us? We like to be independent, but that leaves us cut off and isolated. How well is that working for us? The particularity of Jesus invites us into a relationship with one who is a ruler. And to relate to him in his particulars is to drop the act that we have it together on our own and to yield to the one who's worthy alone to lead our life. The particularity of Jesus means to let him lead the conversation on what's true and important, and for him to be installed as king over the details of our lives. His particularity dictates to us that we can't take bits and pieces of him, but instead must take the material we have before us and ask ourselves, are we willing to relate to him on his terms if he's really the king? The problem with most of us is the problem Zechariah had. The particulars of the good news that God was working in his life to turn upside down that which had been disappointing and shameful. It seemed probably to him like too good a news to believe. And so often we are like him, where the good news of Jesus feels too good to be true for me. Maybe he loves you. I don't know if he loves me. That seems too good in a world where we're accustomed to bad news. And so we heard how this played out. Look at verse 18. Zechariah said to the angel, actually we didn't hear this. We stopped at verse 17. So here's how this plays out. Verse 18, Zechariah says to the angel, how shall I know this? How in the world do I know this? One of the questions Dietrich Bonhoeffer posed in his book, Christ the Center, I love this line where he says, essentially, how is the question of the atheist? Who is the question of faith? Right? That's really what he's doing. He says, how shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years. And the angel answered him, I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. And the people who are waiting for Zechariah, by the way, when a priest goes into the temple and doesn't come out pretty quick, people get worried that he got smoked, right? So people are anxious outside, the people were waiting, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. Not like, I wonder if he's having the best time of his life, but like, I think he might be a goner. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. There was an expectation. Temple's where you meet God. He's going to do things. He may show you something. He may speak to you. And he kept on making signs to them and remained mute. And when his service was ended, he went home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived. And for 5 months, she kept to herself hidden, saying, thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me to take away my reproach among people. And so what we need is to allow ourselves to be like Zechariah and be silenced by the unfolding story. If you find yourself cynical like Zechariah, going, this is too good a news. Perhaps the solution is to just silence the cynicism, to be quiet before the unfolding goodness of God in the story he's telling in Luke's gospel. Accept the challenge to be stunned out of our expectations of bad news and allow the good news of the gospel to have the final word. But more yet, we should be like Elizabeth, less like Zechariah. Elizabeth sees the intervention of God in her moment. She sees the intervention of God in her life as her greatest hope and comfort. She says, this takes away my reproach. In other words, God doing for her what she could not do for herself. We recognize in this gospel announcement, God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves. This unmistakable good gift by giving the gift of the Savior King and his cousin who will point the way. She had gospel receiving faith. He had gospel doubting skepticism. Right? But he, in the end, allowed the story to unfold, listened to what the angel told him, submitted himself to see where the story went. If you're a skeptic today, that's fine. Be like Zechariah and see where the story leads, letting the unfolding events of the story lead you where the evidence does. And I pray it silences the deepest cynicism that says that's too good a news for me in my life. And I pray that it becomes Zechariah's erupting joy that we see later on in the chapter. The question is, am I more like Zechariah today, too ready to dismiss this particular story as too good for me? Or am I like Elizabeth today, who readily accepts that God is the giver of good gifts? And in particular, the promised King who's come to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, to set us right with God, to bring the salvation of his kingdom into our lives. Just as he did for her what she could not do for herself, he does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And we see the full flowering of this story ultimately at the cross. That the good news isn't too good to be true, because Jesus took on the full weight of the bad news. He didn't say the bad news isn't there. He just absorbed it completely into himself because he was compelled by obedience to the Father and love for you and I. And so by seeing where this story arc goes in Luke's gospel, to the self-giving love of Jesus, to him giving his body and his blood for us to make us a part of his kingdom, to welcome us in his rule, to make us partners with him in his rule, came at incredible cost. And we celebrate that at the table today. And so as Aaron leads us in songs of response this morning, I invite us to pray now as we contemplate receiving and celebrating what it cost Jesus to redeem us all. God, we thank you that there were eyewitnesses bold to tell your story. We thank you that you entered into our history to redeem us in our history, our personal histories and our corporate history as a race of humans. And we thank you that you've come as King. You've come as King in gentleness and humility, and you will come as King in power and glory. And God, we want to be receptive now to your kingdom rule in our lives, to make room to be led and shepherded by the true and greater David, the one who is sinless and yet bore our sins, the one who is infinite and yet entered human flesh and suffered and died. We receive your reign and rule accomplished through your self-giving death. and pray your kingdom come more and more in our lives today as we yield to you. In Christ's name.